Here's what nobody wants to think about. We might not be the first, not the first humans, not the first civilization, not even the first time we've reached this level. Every school teaches the same story. Humans evolved. We invented agriculture. Cities appeared. Writing emerged. Civilization began about 5,000 years ago. Before that, nothing but hunters and gatherers. But that story has cracks, big ones. In 1995, divers found something off the coast of Japan. Massive stone structures, terraces, carved steps, right angles that don't appear in nature. The Yonaguni Monument sits underwater. It's been there since the last ice age ended. That's 10,000 years ago. Thousands of years before we supposedly built anything. Mainstream archaeologists say it's natural, erosion, geological formations. Maybe. But the right angles are hard to explain. The steps are hard to explain. The terraces are hard to explain. And it's not alone. Off the coast of India, sonar found structures in the Gulf of Cambay. They're 120 feet underwater. Carbon dating of materials pulled from the site, 9,500 years old. That's older than the pyramids, older than Mesopotamia, older than everything we call civilization. The pattern keeps appearing. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, massive stone temples, precise carvings, astronomical alignments, built 11,600 years ago. We're told humans were hunter-gatherers then. No cities, no organization, no technology for that kind of construction. Yet there it is, in the ground. Undeniable. Here's what makes this disturbing. Sea levels were 400 feet lower during the last ice age. The coastlines we know didn't exist. Humans naturally settle near water. They build cities on coasts, river valleys, natural harbours. All of those places are underwater now, have been for 12,000 years. We've explored less than 5% of the ocean floor, less than 5%. And in that tiny fraction, we keep finding structures that shouldn't exist, anomalies that don't fit the timeline. What's in the other 95%? The archaeological record has a massive gap. From 12,000 to 10,000 years ago, something happened. Climate chaos, the Younger Dryas period. Temperatures swung wildly. Sea levels rose hundreds of feet. Coastlines vanished. River valleys flooded. If there were cities on those coasts, they're gone. Underwater, under sediment, under 12,000 years of ocean. We only find what survives. Stone survives. Pyramids survive. But wood rots, fabric decays, even metal corrodes. After 10,000 years underwater, almost nothing would remain. Just stone, just the biggest structures, just hints. And we keep finding hints. This isn't about aliens. It's not about conspiracy theories. It's about what the evidence actually shows when you look at it. Structures older than they should be. Technology appearing too early. Gaps in the record that swallow thousands of years. The question isn't whether it happens again. It's whether we're already in the pattern. To understand where we are, we need to look at what archaeologists keep finding. The layers tell a story, not the story we expected, not the comfortable timeline we teach in schools. Something stranger. In Greenland, ice cores go back 100,000 years. Each layer captures 1 year of snowfall, trapped air bubbles, dust particles, volcanic ash, chemical signatures of what the atmosphere was like when that snow fell. Scientists can read these layers like tree rings. They show temperature, precipitation, even forest fires thousands of miles away. The ice remembers everything, and what it shows is disturbing. Around 12,900 years ago, the layers change. Suddenly, dramatically. There's a spike in platinum, iridium, rare metals that don't appear naturally in ice. They come from space, from cosmic impacts. The same layer appears across North America, Europe, Asia, the Middle East, a global signature, something hit Earth, hard. But here's what's strange. The impact markers appear with something else, nanodiamonds. These only form under extreme pressure and heat, the kind you get from explosions, or impacts, or both. The layer also contains carbon spherules, tiny balls of charred material. They form when organic matter burns at extremely high temperatures. Trees, grass, animals, everything burning at once. Geologists call it the Younger Dryas boundary layer. It marks the moment everything changed. The ice cores show what happened next. Temperatures dropped. Fast. Within decades, the climate shifted from warm to ice. Age conditions. Glaciers advanced. Sea levels dropped. Then, 1,200 years later, temperatures shot up again. Just as fast. This wasn't gradual climate change. This was chaos. Sediment cores from lakes tell the same story. Before the boundary layer, you find pollen from forests, oak, pine, birch, signs of temperate climate, rich vegetation. After the boundary layer, nothing, just clay, silt. The pollen disappears, the forest died. For over 1,000 years, the sediment shows a barren landscape. Ocean cores match the pattern. The Atlantic shows a massive influx of fresh water around 12,900 years ago. Ice melting, glaciers collapsing, sea levels rising hundreds of feet. But it's the archaeological layers that make you think. Sites across North America show the same pattern. Below the boundary layer you find Clovis points. These were the stone tools of the people living here. Distinctive, well made. They appear at hundreds of sites. Above the boundary layer, the Clovis culture vanishes, just gone. The tools change, the sites change, different people, different technology. Something happened to the Clovis people, all of them, across an entire continent. The megafauna layers tell another story. Below the boundary you find bones, mammoths, mastodons, giant sloths, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves. North America had more large animals than Africa does today. Above the boundary, 35 species gone, extinct, not gradually, suddenly. The bones just stop appearing. These weren't small animals. These were creatures that had survived multiple ice ages, millions of years of climate change. They made it through everything Earth threw at them, until 12,900 years ago. In Syria, archaeologists found something that doesn't fit. Abu Huraira was a village. People lived there, grew crops, raised animals, normal life. Then the boundary layer appears, and in that layer the buildings show signs of intense heat. Mud bricks melted, turned to glass. That takes temperatures over 2,000 degrees. The layer also contains melt glass, tiny fragments of minerals that liquefied and resolidified. You see this at nuclear test sites, impact craters, places where extreme heat hit suddenly. What could do that to a village? The same melt glass appears at sites across the Middle East, North America, Europe, all in the same layer, all at the same time. Something burned these places, all at once, across the world. Archaeologists found the layer at Pilauco in Chile. Same platinum spike, same nanodiamonds, same carbon spherules, but also something else, a layer of ash, thick, widespread. Analysis shows it came from massive wildfires, the kind that burn entire regions. The ash contains particles from hundreds of different plants, forests, grasslands, everything burning together. Climate models show what would happen if something hit the ice sheet covering North America. The impact would vaporize billions of tons of ice instantly. Steam, water vapor, heat. The debris would spread across the atmosphere, burning fragments falling everywhere, starting fires across 2 continents. The fires would create their own weather. Smoke blocking the sun, ash falling like snow, temperatures dropping from the darkness. Meanwhile, all that melted ice has to go somewhere, into the ocean, raising sea levels, flooding coastlines, drowning everything near water, which is where humans lived, where they built, where they settled. The geological evidence shows this happened. The layers prove it. But here's what keeps me up at night. We only know about this because ice cores and sediment cores preserve the record. The layers survived. We can read them. But what if this wasn't the first time? The ice cores only go back 100,000 years in most places. Some reach 800,000 years, but Earth is 4.5 billion years old. We're reading less than 1% of the story. Ocean sediment cores go back further, millions of years in some places, and they show patterns, cycles of warming and cooling, sudden climate shifts, extinction events. Every 12,000 years or so, something happens. The climate destabilizes, species die, the layers show disruption. It's not exact, not like clockwork, but the pattern is there, buried in the sediment, written in the ice, carved into the rock. The KT boundary layer killed the dinosaurs 66 million years ago. Everyone knows that one. Iridium spike, impact markers, global fires, mass extinction. But there are other boundaries, smaller, more recent. The layers show them, events that reset the biosphere, cleared the board, let evolution start over. And here's the thing about layers, they only preserve what doesn't dissolve. Stone survives, bone survives if it fossilizes, but wood rots, metal corrodes, plastic breaks down, fabric disappears. After 12,000 years, almost nothing remains. The layer tells you something happened, but it can't tell you what was lost. If there were cities on the coast 13,000 years ago, they're underwater now, under 400 feet of ocean, under sediment, under 12,000 years of decay. The layer would show the impact, the fires, the climate chaos, but not the cities, not the culture, not the people, just the reset. Geologists found shocked quartz in the Younger Dryas layer. These are quartz crystals with fracture patterns. They only form under extreme pressure. Nuclear explosions create them. So do meteor impacts. The crystals appear across 4 continents. Same layer, same age, same fracture patterns. Something hit hard enough to shock quartz across the world. The question isn't whether it happened. The layers prove it happened. The question is what was here when it did. We assume nothing. We assume humans were primitive, hunter-gatherers, no cities, no technology, no civilization to lose. But we assumed that about Göbekli Tepe too, until we dug it up. We assumed it about the Antikythera mechanism, until divers found it. We assumed it about the pyramids until we realized we still can't explain how they were built. We keep assuming. And the ground keeps proving us wrong. The layers don't lie. They can't. They're physical evidence, chemical signatures, atomic structures that can't be faked or misinterpreted. They show a pattern, impact, fire, climate chaos, extinction, reset, and then life continues. Evolution adapts, new species emerge, survivors rebuild until the next layer. What strikes me most is how complete the erasure is. The Younger Dryas reset didn't just change the climate, it rewrote the landscape. Coastlines moved hundreds of miles, river valleys flooded, mountains that were ice-free became glaciers. Any map from before would be useless after. Any knowledge of where things were would be wrong. Any infrastructure built for that world would be gone. The survivors would have to start over. Not from zero, maybe, but close. And they did. We know they did. Because 11,600 years ago, Göbekli Tepe appears, massive, sophisticated, built by people who supposedly had no technology for it. Unless they did. unless they were rebuilding, unless the layers had buried what they knew before. The evidence sits in museums, ice cores in freezers, sediment samples in storage, the layers waiting to be read, each one a chapter, each one a story of what Earth can do, what it has done, what it might do again. We're not separate from this pattern, we're part of it, living in the space between layers, building on ground that has been reset before. The layers remember, even if we don't. If you made it this far, subscribe. Leave your city and time in the comments. I love seeing where these stories reach. There's something comforting about that. Strangers across the world, different time zones, different languages. But we're all wondering the same things. What came before? What did we lose? What might we lose again? The questions connect us. The not knowing connects us. We're all trying to make sense of the same evidence, the same layers, the same patterns buried in the ground. The Younger Dryas started fast. Within decades, maybe faster. Ice cores from Greenland show the shift happened in less than a human lifetime. Some estimates say 10 years. One generation watched the world change. Temperature dropped. Rain patterns shifted. The megafauna that survived the initial impact started dying off. Mammoths, giant sloths, saber-toothed cats. They'd made it through the comet fragments, but they couldn't handle what came next. The cold lasted 1,300 years. That's long enough for entire cultures to rise and fall. Long enough for people to forget what came before. Long enough for cities to crumble and forests to reclaim the ruins. Think about what 1,300 years means. That's longer than the entire history of the United States. Longer than the Roman Empire lasted in the West. It's the distance from Charlemagne to now, from the Vikings to the internet. Imagine if our civilization collapsed today, if the climate shifted and cities emptied. What would remain after 1,300 years? Steel rusts, concrete crumbles, glass shatters, plastics break down faster than we thought. The stuff we think is permanent isn't. Wood disappears in decades without maintenance. Paper turns to dust. Cloth dissolves. Even stone structures crack and fall when nobody maintains them. Nature is patient. It reclaims everything. The Younger Dryas ended the same way it started, fast. Around 9,700 BCE, temperatures jumped. Within 50 years, maybe less, the ice retreated. Sea levels rose. The world warmed back to roughly where it had been before. But here's what matters. When the warming came, humans were different. The people who emerged from the Younger Dryas weren't the same as the ones who went in. Before the cold period, humans were hunter-gatherers. They moved with the seasons, followed herds, gathered plants. They'd been doing this successfully for 190,000 years. It worked. After the Younger Dryas, agriculture appears, almost immediately. Within a few hundred years of the warming, people in multiple locations start farming. They domesticate plants, build permanent settlements, create pottery. The whole package shows up fast. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey dates to 9,600 BCE, right when the Younger Dryas ended. It's a massive stone temple complex, pillars weighing 20 tons, carved animals, sophisticated construction, and it's not a city, it's not a settlement, it's purely ceremonial. The people who built it were still hunter-gatherers, no evidence of agriculture at the site, no domesticated animals, no permanent homes, but they organised labour, moved massive stones, created art, built something that would last. This is weird. Hunter-gatherers aren't supposed to build monuments. They're supposed to be too busy surviving, too mobile, too scattered. But here's proof they could. They did. Within 1,000 years, agriculture spreads across the Fertile Crescent. Wheat, barley, lentils, peas, all domesticated around the same time. Different plants, different regions, but the same basic idea appearing everywhere. Egypt develops farming, the Indus Valley, China, Mesoamerica. These are separate populations, thousands of miles apart, no contact with each other. But they all start farming within a few thousand years of each other. The standard explanation is that it was inevitable. Humans were ready, climate stabilized, population pressure increased. Farming was the natural next step, but humans had stable climate before, for thousands of years between ice ages, warm periods, abundant game, good conditions. They didn't farm then, they kept hunting and gathering. Something about the Younger Dryas changed the equation. The cold period lasted long enough that people had to adapt, had to think differently, had to organise in new ways. Or maybe they were remembering. Maybe agriculture wasn't invented after the Younger Dryas. Maybe it was reinvented. There's a site in Syria called Abu Huraira. It sits right on the timeline. People lived there before the Younger Dryas, during it, and after it. The layers tell the story. Before the cold hit, they were hunter-gatherers, eating wild plants, hunting gazelle, standard stuff. Then the Younger Dryas begins. The layers show the climate shift. Pollen changes, animal bones change. During the cold period, they start eating different plants, more grains, seeds that require processing, labour-intensive foods they wouldn't normally bother with. They're adapting, making do with what's available. Then the warming comes, and suddenly there's evidence of cultivation, domesticated grains. They didn't just go back to hunting and gathering, they kept farming. They'd learned something during the hard times. The site was excavated in the 1970s. Then it was flooded by a dam project. The evidence is underwater now, but the data survived. The layers were documented. The transition is clear. What strikes me most is the speed. Agriculture doesn't develop slowly at Abu Huraira. It appears within generations, like flipping a switch. People who knew how to farm just started doing it when conditions allowed. That suggests knowledge, memory, maybe oral traditions that preserve techniques through the cold centuries, maybe stories about how things used to be, how to plant, how to harvest, how to store grain, or maybe the Younger Dryas forced innovation, desperate people trying desperate things. Some of those things worked, got passed down, became standard, practice. Either way, the result is the same. Humans after the Younger Dryas are different. They build, they farm, they settle, they create surplus, they develop hierarchy, they write, all within a few thousand years. Before the Younger Dryas, we have 190,000 years of basically similar human behaviour. After it, civilization explodes. Cities, empires, technology, art, science. Everything we think of as human achievement happens in the last 10,000 years. That's 5% of human history. 95% was something else, something simpler, or something we can't see anymore. The question is why? What changed? Was it just climate stabilizing? Was it population pressure? Was it collective trauma forcing adaptation? Or was it recovery? People rebuilding what they'd lost? There's evidence for all of these, but there's also evidence that doesn't fit any of them. In 2007, researchers found something strange in the Younger Dryas layers. Microscopic diamonds, nanodiamonds. They form under intense pressure and heat. Impacts, explosions, extreme events. The same layers that mark the start of the Younger Dryas have these diamonds scattered through them. Across North America, Europe, Asia, a global signature. But there's more. The layers also contain spherules, tiny glass beads. They form when rock melts and cools rapidly, like in an impact. or an airburst, and there's black mat, a layer of dark sediment full of carbon, burned material, soot. It appears at dozens of sites, right at the Younger Dryas boundary. Some researchers think this shows multiple impacts, fragments of a comet hitting Earth, setting fires, throwing debris into the atmosphere, triggering the cooling. Others think it's a massive airburst, like Tunguska in 1908, but bigger. Something exploding in the atmosphere with enough force to devastate a continent. The evidence is controversial. Other scientists question the interpretation, say the nanodiamonds could form other ways, that the spherules aren't necessarily from impacts, that the black mat could be natural, but the correlation is hard to ignore. The markers appear right when the climate shifts, right when the megafauna die off, right when human populations crash. And here's what really matters. If there were impacts, if there were air bursts, what did they hit? Empty wilderness? Or something more? The ice cores show the atmosphere changed. Dust levels spiked. Nitrates appeared. Chemical signatures of burning. Massive fires. Continental scale. If there were cities, they burned. If there were forests, they burned. If there were farms, they burned. The ash went into the atmosphere, blocked the sun, triggered the cooling. We know this pattern. We've seen it in recent history. Krakatoa in 1883, Tambora in 1815, volcanic eruptions that changed global climate, caused crop failures, famine, social collapse. The Younger Dryas impact would have been worse, multiple strikes, more energy, more debris, longer effects, and when it was over, when the dust settled and the climate stabilised, what remained? Survivors, scattered groups, people who'd lived through the cold, adapted, endured. They carried memories, stories, knowledge, some of it practical, how to farm, how to build, how to organise labour, some of it mythical, tales of fire from the sky, great floods, lost cities, golden ages. Every ancient culture has these stories. The Greeks talked about Atlantis. The Sumerians wrote about the flood. The Mayans recorded multiple creations and destructions. Hindu texts describe cycles of civilization rising and falling. We treat these as myths, legends, symbolic story about human nature. But what if they're memories, distorted by time, wrapped in religion, but based on something real? The Younger Dryas fits, a catastrophe, a dark age, a recovery. The timeline matches, the evidence matches, the stories match. But proving it is hard, because 12,000 years is a long time. Long enough for almost everything to disappear. Long enough for forests to grow over ruins, for rivers to change course, for coastlines to shift. The sea level rise alone is devastating for evidence. When the ice melted, oceans rose 400 feet. Coastlines moved inland. River valleys flooded. Delta regions drowned. And where do humans live? Near water, rivers, coasts, deltas, the best land, the most productive areas, all underwater now. If there were cities on the coast before the Younger Dryas, they're gone, buried under sediment, under 12,000 years of ocean deposits, under continental shelves that we've barely explored. We've mapped more of Mars than we have of Earth's ocean floor. The deep sea is mostly unknown. The continental shelves are muddy, dark, hard to survey, but we're starting to look. Side-scan sonar, multi-beam imaging, remote sensing. The technology exists. We just haven't used it much for archaeology. When we do look, we find things. Structures off Japan, off India, off Cuba. Formations that might be natural or might not be. The debate continues. What's clear is that the Younger Dryas was a reset. Whatever was developing before that moment got erased. Not completely, not totally, but enough. enough that we lost the thread, enough that we had to start over, enough that the people who came after were building on fragments, pieces, memories of something greater. And they did build. They created civilizations, developed writing, built cities, made art, advanced technology, all in the space of a few thousand years. That's the legacy of the Younger Dryas. Not just destruction, not just loss, but recovery, resilience, the human ability to adapt, to rebuild, to keep going even after everything falls apart. We are the descendants of survivors, people who lived through the cold, who remembered enough to start again, who passed down knowledge through dark centuries until the world was ready to receive it again. That's worth thinking about as you drift towards sleep. As the day dissolves into night, we carry their resilience, their stubbornness, their refusal to give up. The world ended. They survived. The climate shifted. They adapted. The old ways died. They learned new ones. And here we are, 12,000 years later, still building, still learning, still carrying forward whatever it is that makes us human. The Bronze Age didn't collapse once. It collapsed twice. Most people know about 1177 BCE, the late Bronze Age collapse, when the Mediterranean world fell apart. Cities burned, empires crumbled, writing systems vanished. But there was another collapse, earlier, around 4,200 years ago, 2200 BCE, and it followed the same pattern. This one gets less attention. It's older, the evidence is harder to read, but it's there, clear as day once you know what to look for. Around 2200 BCE, civilizations across the Middle East and Mediterranean collapsed simultaneously. Egypt's old kingdom fell. The Akkadian Empire in Mesopotamia disintegrated. Cities in the Levant were abandoned. The Indus Valley civilization declined. These weren't small setbacks. These were total system failures. In Egypt, the Old Kingdom was the Pyramid Age. Khufu, Khafre, the Great Pyramid at Giza. Massive stone monuments that required incredible organization. Thousands of workers, complex logistics, centralized authority. Then it stopped. The pyramids stopped getting built. The central government collapsed. Egypt fractured into competing regions. The first intermediate period began. Chaos that lasted over a century. Egyptian texts from this time are dark. Really dark. They describe famine, social breakdown, violence. The admonitions of Ipuwer talks about the Nile running red, the poor becoming rich, the rich becoming poor, everything inverted. Some scholars think the text is exaggerated, literary drama, but the archaeology backs it up. Settlement patterns changed, population declined, grave goods got simpler, the wealth disappeared. In Mesopotamia, the Akkadian Empire was the first multi-ethnic empire in history. Sargon of Akkad conquered the Sumerian city-states around 2334 BCE, united them under one ruler. His grandson Naram-Sin expanded the empire further. Then around 2200 BCE, it fell apart. Fast. Within decades, the empire was gone, cities abandoned. The capital at Akkad disappeared so completely we've never found it. Cuneiform tablets from this period talk about invasions. Barbarians from the mountains, the Gutians. They swept down from the Zagros mountains and destroyed everything. But here's the thing, the Gutians were always there. Mountain tribes. Raiders. They'd been around for centuries. Why did they suddenly succeed in destroying an empire? The answer appears in the dirt, literally. Soil samples from this period show something strange. A massive drought. The worst in thousands of years. It lasted for 300 years. 3 centuries of reduced rainfall. Failed harvests, dying rivers. Archaeologists found telltale signs at dozens of sites, dust layers, wind-blown sediment, the kind that accumulates when there's no vegetation to hold the soil down, when farms turn to desert. In Syria, the city of Tel Leilan was abandoned around 2200 BCE. It had been a major urban centre, thousands of people, trade networks, agriculture. Then everyone left. The excavators found a thick layer of volcanic ash and wind-blown dust right at the abandonment level. No gradual decline, just sudden departure. The city stayed empty for 300 years. Climate records confirm it. Ocean sediment cores from the Gulf of Oman show a spike in dust particles around 2200 BCE, wind-blown material from Mesopotamia, from dried-up rivers and failed farms. Lake sediments in the Dead Sea region show the same thing. Lower water levels, increased salinity, drought conditions. This wasn't a local problem, this was regional, maybe global. In the Indus Valley, the Harappan civilization was thriving. Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, planned cities with sophisticated drainage systems, standardized weights and measures, long-distance trade networks. Around 2200 BCE, it started falling apart. Not all at once, but the decline began. Cities were gradually abandoned, the writing system disappeared, the trade networks broke down. By 1900 BCE, the urban phase was over. People moved to smaller settlements, simpler lifestyles. The complexity vanished. The traditional explanation was invasion. The Aryans came from the north, destroyed the cities, but there's no evidence of mass violence, no burned layers, no weapon caches, no bodies. What there is evidence for is climate change. The monsoon patterns shifted, rainfall decreased. The rivers that fed the Harappan cities started drying up. The Gaga-Hakra River used to flow through the heart of Harappan territory. Satellite imagery shows its ancient course. Dry riverbed stretching for miles. It was a major waterway. Now it's seasonal, barely flows. Geological studies show it started drying up around 2000 BCE, right when the Harappan cities were being abandoned. No water, no agriculture, no cities. The pattern is consistent. Across different regions, different cultures, different political systems, all collapsing at the same time, all showing signs of drought. But why? What caused a 300-year drought? One theory points to volcanic eruptions. Major eruptions can inject enough material into the atmosphere to cool the climate, change precipitation patterns, trigger droughts. There's evidence of significant volcanic activity around 2200 BCE, ash layers in ice cores, sulfate spikes, the signature of major eruptions. But volcanic effects usually last a few years, maybe a decade, not 3 centuries. Another theory focuses on solar activity. The sun goes through cycles, periods of more activity, periods of less. When solar output decreases, Earth's climate can shift. Tree ring data shows reduced solar activity around this time, narrower rings, slower growth, cooler temperatures. But again, the mechanism isn't clear. How does reduced solar activity cause a 300-year drought specifically in the Middle East and Mediterranean? A third theory is more disturbing. Maybe the climate shift was natural, part of a regular cycle we don't fully understand. Periodic droughts that happen every few thousand years. If that's true, it could happen again. We might be living in an unusually stable period, a brief window between climate shifts that we've mistaken for normal. The geological record shows these events repeat. Drought periods at regular intervals, around 4,200 years ago, around 8,200 years ago, around 12,900 years ago. That last one is the Younger Dryas. The same pattern. Climate shift, civilization stress, population decline. The 8.2 kiloyear event is less famous but well documented. Sudden cooling, drought in some regions, flooding in others. It lasted about 160 years. The 4.2 kiloyear event around 2200 BCE fits the pattern. Another climate disruption, another test of human resilience. And here's what's fascinating. Each time, civilization survived. Not intact, not unchanged, but it survived. Egypt recovered. The Middle Kingdom rose from the chaos, new dynasties, new monuments, new prosperity. It took time, but they rebuilt. Mesopotamia recovered. New city-states emerged. New empires formed. The Babylonians, the Assyrians. They built on the ruins of what came before. The Indus Valley people adapted. They moved, changed their lifestyle, became more pastoral, less urban. But they didn't disappear. Their descendants are still there. What didn't survive was the specific form of those civilizations. The Old Kingdom never came back. The Akkadian Empire never reformed. The Harappan cities stayed empty. The people survived. The knowledge survived. But the institutions died. Think about what that means. The pyramids stopped being built, not because people forgot how, but because the social organization required to build them collapsed. The centralized authority, the resource extraction, the labor mobilization. The knowledge was still there. The skills were still there. But the system that made it possible was gone. This is the pattern. Climate stress, system failure, dark age, recovery, but recovery into something different. The civilizations that emerged after 2200 BCE weren't just rebuilt versions of what came before. They were new, different political structures, different economic systems, different technologies. The Middle Kingdom of Egypt was more decentralized than the Old Kingdom, more regional power centers, less absolute control by the pharaoh. The Babylonian Empire was different from the Akkadian Empire. Different administrative systems, different approaches to governance. They learned from the collapse, adapted, built systems that were more resilient, or at least different. But here's the question that keeps me up at night. How much was lost? We know what survived. The monumental architecture, the written records, the stuff that was built to last. But what about the everyday knowledge, the practical skills, the technologies that weren't recorded because everyone knew them? When the Old Kingdom collapsed, did they lose construction techniques? When the Akkadian Empire fell, did some technologies disappear? When the Harappan cities emptied, what knowledge walked away with the people? We can't know. The absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, but it's suggestive. The Bronze Age civilizations that came after 2200 BCE were impressive. But were they as advanced as what came before? In some ways, yes. In other ways, maybe not. The Great Pyramid at Giza was built around 2560 BCE, before the collapse. We still don't fully understand how they did it. The precision, the scale, the logistics. After the collapse, Egyptian pyramids got smaller, simpler, less precise. They were still impressive, but different. Was that a choice, a shift in priorities, or a loss of capability? The same question applies to the other collapses. Each time civilization fell and rebuilt, what got lost in the transition? And if it happened multiple times in the Bronze Age, how many times did it happen before that? Before writing, before we had records. The Younger Dryas was a collapse. The 8.2 kiloyear event was a collapse. The 4.2 kiloyear event was a collapse. That's 3 major climate disruptions in 10,000 years. How many happened in the previous 100,000 years? The previous 200,000 years? If the pattern repeats every few thousand years, there could have been dozens of these events. Dozens of times when human civilization reached a certain level and then got knocked back. Not all the way back, not to zero. but back enough that recovery required generations, enough that knowledge was lost, enough that the people who rebuilt had to rediscover things their ancestors knew. This is what I keep coming back to. The idea that human progress isn't a straight line. It's not even a jagged line always trending upward. It's a cycle. Build, collapse, rebuild, collapse again. Each time a little different. Each time losing some things and gaining others. We're in a building phase now. We've been building for about 200 years of industrial civilization, about 5,000 years of agricultural civilization, about 10,000 years since the last major climate disruption. That's a long, stable period. Unusually long based on the geological record, which means we might be due, not tomorrow, not next year, maybe not for centuries, but the pattern suggests it's coming. Another climate shift, another test. The question is whether we'll handle it better than our ancestors did, whether our technology will save us, whether our global systems are more resilient or more fragile than the Bronze Age kingdoms. I don't know the answer. But the evidence from 2200 BCE isn't encouraging. Those civilizations had survived for centuries. They seemed stable, powerful, permanent. Then the climate shifted, and they fell apart in decades. The survivors rebuilt. They always rebuild. That's what humans do. We're resilient, adaptable, stubborn. But we don't always rebuild the same thing. Sometimes we can't. Sometimes the knowledge is gone. Sometimes the conditions don't allow it. And that's the real lesson of the 4,200-year event. Civilization is more fragile than it looks, more dependent on stable climate than we like to admit, more vulnerable to disruption than we want to believe. The Bronze Age collapsed twice. Different times, different causes, same pattern. Build, thrive, expand. Then something shifts, and it all comes down. The Bronze Age collapsed, then it happened again, then again. 3 times in 2,000 years, 3 times the same pattern. Build, thrive, fall. Each time different details, same result. We've looked at 1177 BCE, the famous one, the Sea Peoples, the burning cities, the Dark Age that followed. We've looked at 2200 BCE, the earlier collapse, the drought that lasted 300 years, the Old Kingdom falling, the Akkadian Empire disappearing. But there's a third one, right in the middle, around 1628 BCE, and this one's different. We can pinpoint the exact moment it started. A volcano exploded, the biggest eruption in 10,000 years. It changed everything. The island was called Thera. Today we call it Santorini. It sits in the Aegean Sea between Greece and Turkey. Beautiful place now. White buildings, blue domes, tourist paradise. In 1628 BCE, it was a thriving Bronze Age settlement, part of the Minoan civilization. Towns, harbours, trade networks, frescoes on the walls showing dolphins and flowers. Then the mountain exploded. Not a regular eruption, a caldera-forming event, the kind that happens maybe once every few thousand years. The entire centre of the island collapsed into the magma chamber below, created a crater 4 miles across, filled with seawater. The explosion was heard 3,000 miles away, maybe further. We can't know for sure because everyone who heard it closer is dead. Volcanic ash from Thera appears in ice cores from Greenland, from Antarctica. It circled the globe, blocked out the sun for months, maybe years. Tree rings from that period show something called frost rings. The wood cells are damaged, deformed. That only happens when trees freeze during the growing season, when summer never comes. Irish bog oaks show frost rings in 1628 BCE. California bristlecone pines show the same thing. Trees in Siberia, in Chile, all around the world, all in the same year. the temperature dropped globally. Not a little. A lot. Enough to kill crops. Enough to cause famines. Enough to destabilize kingdoms. Chinese records from the Shang dynasty mention strange weather around this time. Dim sun, yellow fog, summer frosts, failed harvests. Egyptian records are harder to read. The second intermediate period was already underway. Egypt was fragmented. The Hyksos controlled the north. Native dynasties held the south. But there are references to darkness, to the sun being weak. The Ipuwer papyrus might date from this period. Some scholars think it describes the Thera eruption. Rivers running red, the sun obscured, chaos across the land. But here's what's fascinating. The eruption didn't just cause immediate problems, it triggered a cascade. The Minoan civilization on Crete was the dominant power in the Aegean. Sophisticated, wealthy. They built palaces with indoor plumbing, created art that still looks modern, traded across the Mediterranean. Thera was part of their network. When it exploded, the tsunami hit Crete within minutes. Walls of water 30 feet high, maybe higher. They swept inland, destroyed coastal settlements, flooded harbours. The palaces survived. They were built on high ground, but the infrastructure didn't. The ports were wrecked. The ships were gone. The trade networks collapsed. And then came the ash. Volcanic fallout covering the eastern Mediterranean, ruining crops, poisoning water, making life impossible. The Minoans recovered. Sort of. They rebuilt some palaces, continued for another 200 years. But they were never the same. The power shifted. The Mycenaeans on mainland Greece grew stronger. Eventually they conquered Crete outright. But the effect spread further. Much further. The Hittite Empire in Anatolia was expanding. Strong military, good administration. They controlled trade routes between Asia and Europe. Around 1600 BCE, their records show problems: food, shortages, grain imports from Egypt, political instability. The king Hattusili I had to put down rebellions. His successor Mursili I invaded Babylon, probably to secure grain supplies. The Hittite Empire survived, but it was weakened, vulnerable. It took generations to fully recover. Egypt was already divided. The Hyksos invasion had happened earlier. Foreign rulers controlling the delta. But the volcanic winter made things worse. Famines, unrest. The south couldn't muster strength to expel the Hyksos for another century. When Ahmose I finally drove them out and reunited Egypt around 1550 BCE, he founded the new kingdom. A fresh start. New dynasty, new capital, everything rebuilt. In Mesopotamia, the old Babylonian Empire was declining. Hammurabi had died. His successors couldn't hold the empire together. The Kassites invaded from the east. The Hittites raided from the north. By 1595 BCE, Babylon fell. The dynasty ended. Another collapse. Another dark period. The pattern keeps appearing. Stress, instability, collapse. Not all at once, not everywhere simultaneously, but cascading. One failure triggering another. The volcanic winter lasted maybe 3 years. The direct effects were temporary, but the secondary effects lasted decades, generations. Failed harvests mean famine. Famine means migration. Migration means conflict. Conflict means war. War means more instability, more collapse. The Bronze Age was interconnected. More than people realize, trade networks linked Egypt to Mesopotamia, to Anatolia, to Greece, to the Levant. Tin from Afghanistan, copper from Cyprus, gold from Nubia, grain from Egypt. When one part failed, the whole system wobbled. When multiple parts failed simultaneously, it crashed. The Thera eruption was a shock, a massive external stress on an already complex system, and the system couldn't absorb it. Some places adapted, some didn't. The difference often came down to geography, to resources, to leadership, to luck. Egypt had the Nile. Even in drought the river provided. Even in volcanic winter something grew. They suffered, but they survived. Mesopotamia had the Tigris and Euphrates, irrigation, agriculture, stored grain. They survived too. Barely. But smaller kingdoms, coastal cities dependent on trade, they went under, just disappeared from the record. Archaeologists find abandonment layers from this period, cities that were thriving in 1650 BCE, empty by 1600 BCE. No signs of violence, no burning, just abandonment. People left, walked away, went somewhere else, somewhere with food, somewhere with water, somewhere with hope. The survivors didn't write about it, not directly. Bronze Age records are sparse, fragmentary. We get hints, references, suggestions. But the archaeology is clear. Population declined, settlement patterns changed, trade decreased, complexity reduced. It took 50 years for things to stabilise, another 50 to really recover. By 1500 BCE, the Bronze Age was booming again. New Kingdom Egypt, Hittite resurgence, Mycenaean expansion. But it was different. The old Minoan dominance was gone. New powers emerged, new trade routes, new political arrangements. That's the pattern. Collapse, Dark Age, recovery, but recovery into something new, not restoration, transformation. And here's what keeps me thinking. This was the middle collapse, not the first, not the last. The Bronze Age had already survived one major disruption in 2200 BCE. It would face another in 1177 BCE, 3 times in 2000 years. 3 times the system crashed. 3 times it rebuilt. What does that tell us? That Bronze Age civilization was fragile or resilient? Both. That's the answer. Both. Fragile enough to collapse when stressed. Resilient enough to recover afterward. The vulnerability came from interconnection. When everything depends on everything else, one failure cascades. The tin trade stops. Bronze production halts. Weapons can't be made. Armies can't fight. Kingdoms can't defend themselves. The resilience came from knowledge. The people who survived knew how to farm, how to build, how to organize, how to trade. They carried that knowledge through the dark times, used it to rebuild. But some knowledge was lost. We can see it in the archaeology. Technologies that existed before 1628 BCE gone afterward. Building techniques, artistic styles, manufacturing methods. The linear script that the Minoans used, never deciphered. It disappeared. The Mycenaeans developed Linear B instead. Different system. Simpler. Less sophisticated. Was Linear A more advanced? We don't know. Can't read it. But it's suggestive. The fact that it was abandoned, that the knowledge of how to write it was lost. What else was lost? What practical technologies? What engineering knowledge? What agricultural techniques? We can't know. The absence of evidence isn't proof, but it's there. The gaps, the discontinuities, the things that existed before and not after. Each collapse was a filter, a test. What survived was what people could remember, could teach, could pass down orally through the dark years. Complex knowledge requires institutions, schools, apprenticeships, written records. When institutions collapse, complex knowledge disappears. Simple knowledge survives. How to plant wheat, how to make bread, how to build a house, the basics. But the advanced stuff, the specialized techniques, the innovations that took generations to develop, those die with the specialists who knew them. The Bronze Age collapsed 3 times. Each time some knowledge was lost. Each time the civilization that rebuilt was different. Sometimes simpler, sometimes just different. By 1177 BCE, when the final collapse came, the Bronze Age had already been reset twice, already lost knowledge twice, already rebuilt twice. That final collapse was the hardest. The recovery took longest. The Dark Age lasted 400 years, maybe because it was the third strike, maybe because the system had less resilience left, maybe because more knowledge had been lost in the previous resets, or maybe it was just bad luck, bad timing, the wrong stresses at the wrong moment. We talk about the Bronze Age collapse like it was one event, but it wasn't. It was three separate catastrophes, 3 separate recoveries, 3 chapters in the same story. And that story is about cycles, about civilizations rising and falling, about knowledge gained and lost, about humanity adapting to whatever gets thrown at it. The Thera eruption was natural. Nobody caused it. Nobody could have prevented it. It just happened. And when it happened, it tested everything. Every kingdom, every system, every assumption about how the world worked. Some passed the test, some failed. The ones that survived weren't necessarily the strongest, or the smartest, or the most advanced. They were the ones in the right place, with the right resources, with enough flexibility to adapt. Egypt survived all 3 Bronze Age collapses, not unchanged, not unscathed, but survived. Mesopotamia survived all 3. Different empires, different dynasties, but continuous. The Minoans didn't survive. The Akkadians didn't survive. The Old Kingdom didn't survive. The difference was geography, resources, luck. And that's what's terrifying. That survival isn't about being the best. It's about being lucky, about happening to have what you need when crisis hits. The Bronze Age civilizations were advanced, sophisticated. They built monuments that still stand, created art that still moves us, developed technologies we still use, but they were vulnerable to volcanoes, to drought, to climate shifts, to cascading failures in systems they didn't fully understand. 3 times they fell, 3 times they rebuilt, each time losing something, each time changing. We like to think we're different, that our civilization is more stable, more resilient, more permanent, but we're more interconnected than the Bronze Age ever was, more dependent on complex systems, more vulnerable to cascading failures, and the natural world doesn't care. Volcanoes still erupt, climate still shifts, droughts still happen. The Bronze Age teaches us that collapse isn't the end. People survive, knowledge survives, civilization rebuilds. But it also teaches us that what rebuilds isn't what fell, that knowledge gets lost, that complexity can disappear, that recovery takes time. 3 collapses, 3 recoveries, 3 lessons in human resilience and human vulnerability. The question isn't whether our civilization could collapse. The Bronze Age proves it can. The question is what we'd lose, what knowledge would disappear, what would the survivors have to rediscover, and whether we'd rebuild into something better or just something different. Why do civilizations keep falling? Why do patterns like this show up again and again, not just in the Bronze Age, but across so many different periods and places? That's where things get interesting. It's not just bad luck or bad leadership. Some researchers think there's something bigger at play, something that comes from outside Earth itself. Let's talk about cosmic impacts, not just the giant asteroid that killed the dinosaurs, but smaller ones too. The kind that might not end all life, but could mess up a whole civilization. The kind that leave fingerprints in the ground, but not always a clear story in old writings. There's a strange pattern in the evidence. When scientists look at ancient soil and ice, they sometimes find clues that don't make much sense at first. Tiny particles you don't expect to see. Things like platinum and iridium. metals that are rare on Earth's surface but common in space rocks. And these particles show up in layers that line up with times of chaos in human history. One of the weirdest examples comes from about 12,800 years ago. That's way before the Bronze Age, but the pattern matters. Something big happened then. It was cold already. People were living in the last days of the Ice Age. Suddenly the climate took a nosedive. It got even colder. Fast. Many animals died out. Human groups shrank or vanished from some areas. When scientists drilled into the ground to study this time, they found a layer filled with strange stuff. Nanodiamonds, tiny diamonds formed under huge pressure, melted glass, shocked quartz. All of these things form when something hits the Earth really hard, like a comet or an asteroid. But there's no giant crater from that time, no huge hole like the one in Mexico from the dinosaur-killing asteroid. So what happened? Some scientists think a comet broke apart in the atmosphere. The fragments rained down over a huge area, maybe even across continents. The blast would have set off wildfires, thrown dust into the sky, blocked out the sun for months or even years. And here's where it connects to civilization. If something like that happened when people were building cities instead of just hunting and gathering, it would be a disaster. Crops would fail. Livestock would die. People would starve or move away. Buildings would burn. And just like that, an advanced society could vanish. Now, is there proof that this kind of thing happened during the Bronze Age collapses? Not direct proof like a crater with a date carved into it. But there are hints. For example, at the end of the Bronze Age, around 1200 BCE, some scientists noticed spikes of rare metals in the soil from that time. There are also reports of layers of charcoal, evidence of huge fires. Some of these fires were so big they could only have been started by something more than just human fighting or normal forest fires. There's also the question of sudden climate changes. When you get a whole string of droughts, or a few years where the sun seems weak and crops fail everywhere, it starts to look like something more than just bad weather. Maybe a volcano, maybe a cosmic impact. It's easy to think of cosmic impacts as rare, and the really big ones are. But smaller impacts happen more often. Every century or so, a rock the size of a house hits somewhere on Earth. Usually it lands in the ocean or an empty desert. We barely notice. But every few thousand years a bigger one comes along, big enough to cause trouble. In 1908, a small comet or asteroid exploded over Siberia. The blast flattened 800 square miles of forest. That's an area bigger than most cities. If the Tunguska event had happened over a place like Paris or Cairo, it would have wiped out millions of people in seconds. But what if an event like that happened in ancient times? Not big enough to end the world, just big enough to destroy a kingdom, or start a chain reaction of problems. The evidence is scattered, but it keeps showing up. In the Middle East, there are ancient cities that show signs of sudden destruction, not by war, not by fire alone. The mud bricks are melted, the pottery is fused. It looks like they were hit by a blast hotter than any normal fire. One city, called Tall El Hammam, sits near the Dead Sea. Archaeologists found a layer of melted rock there, dating to about 3,700 years ago. It matches the timing of some of the early Bronze Age troubles. The people vanished. The city wasn't rebuilt for centuries. Something strange happened there. Could it have been a cosmic airburst? Maybe. Scientists found high levels of rare metals in the soil. Again, ones that come from space. They also found trinitite, a green glass that forms when sand melts in a nuclear blast or a meteor explosion. The pattern matches what you'd see if a space rock exploded in the air. That's just one example. There are others, though the evidence isn't always as clear. In the Indus Valley, cities like Mohenjo-Daro show signs of sudden destruction. Some skeletons were found lying in the street, as if people died instantly. The timing is close to one of the ancient collapses. Was it disease, war, or something stranger? We can't say for sure, but the idea is simple. If a space rock hits or explodes in the sky, it can start a disaster. Fires, famine, poisoned water, panic. Even if the blast misses the city, the dust could block the sun. Crops would fail for years. People would leave or starve. The survivors might forget what happened. All that would be left is a story, or a layer of melted rock. Now let's think about how this fits with the other causes of collapse. It's rarely just one thing. Sometimes a civilization is already struggling. There's drought, trade is down, people are on edge. Then something big happens. A volcano, a cosmic impact, something nobody could plan for. That's the tipping point, the last straw. And this is where the theory gets interesting. Some people think that ancient stories about fire from the sky or gods hurling thunderbolts are memories of these events. The details get mixed up over time. Myths grow. But sometimes the stories line up with what scientists find in the ground. For example, there's an old story from Mesopotamia about a city destroyed by fire that fell from the heavens. The Bible has the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Cities wiped out in a sudden blast. Are these just stories, or are they memories of real disasters? Maybe a bit of both. If you look at enough myths from around the world, you start to see patterns. Tales of darkness, of the sun vanishing, of years when nothing grew, of floods and fire. They're not all about the same event, but they might be echoes of things people saw and struggled to understand. And here's another thought. When a civilization falls, people often blame it on the gods, or on bad luck, or on their enemies. But sometimes the cause is something nobody could have predicted. Something from space. Something that doesn't care about borders or kings. The cosmic impact theory doesn't explain every collapse. Sometimes it's just drought, or war, or disease. But it's one more piece of the puzzle. One more way that nature can sweep the board and force people to start over. Let's zoom out for a second. Earth moves through space. It's not just sitting still. Every year, our planet passes through clouds of dust and debris left by old comets. Most of it burns up in the atmosphere, just shooting stars. But sometimes bigger pieces survive. Sometimes a whole cluster of rocks comes by at once. The ancient Egyptians and Babylonians watched the skies carefully. They recorded strange events, bright lights, fireballs, sudden darkness. Sometimes these events lined up with hard years, failed crops, unrest. It's not proof, but it's suggestive. Even today we get reminders. In 2013, a small asteroid exploded over Chelyabinsk, Russia. It shattered windows and injured over 1,000 people. No one saw it coming. It was only 66 feet wide, about the size of a house. Imagine a rock 10 times that size. So, if this kind of thing keeps happening, why don't we have more records? Why aren't there more craters? The answer is simple. Most impacts happen in the ocean. Water covers 70% of Earth's surface. A rock that lands in the Pacific makes a big splash, not a big crater. The tsunami could still be deadly, but the evidence washes away. Even on land, erosion and time erase the scars. Forests grow back, rivers change course. Cities are built, then abandoned, then buried. Only the luckiest layers survive for us to find. But here's something that always strikes me. When you line up the times of chaos in old records with the layers of strange metals and melted rock, they match more often than you would expect by chance. Not every time, but enough to make you wonder. So, what does this mean for civilizations? It means that sometimes collapse comes from above. not just from within, not just from human mistakes or political failures or even volcanoes. Sometimes disaster falls out of the sky, but there's another side to this. Cosmic impacts aren't just about destruction. They also reset the game. They force survivors to adapt, to move, to rethink how they live. Sometimes that leads to new ideas, new ways of doing things. If you look at the years after big disasters, you often see bursts of creativity, new tools, new stories, new religions. Maybe people are trying to make sense of what happened. Maybe they're just making do. But change follows chaos. The cosmic theory isn't the only explanation for lost civilizations, but it helps explain why advanced societies can disappear so quickly, why knowledge can vanish, why even the best organized kingdoms can face sudden ruin. And it's humbling, because it reminds us that we're not in control of everything, that the universe is bigger than any empire, that sometimes survival comes down to luck, or to being in the right place at the right time. There's even a theory that some lost civilizations might have reached a high level, only to be erased by a cosmic impact. No trace left but scattered stones and melted glass. Maybe that's why we find signs of sudden change, or strange objects buried deep in the earth. Maybe that's why we see gaps in the record. Could it happen again? Of course. Space is full of rocks. Most are harmless. Some are not. We have better ways to watch the skies now, but we can't see everything. And we're still vulnerable, just like people in the past. Still, there's comfort in knowing we're not alone in facing these risks. Every generation has dealt with threats from beyond. Every civilization has faced the unknown. Some survived, some didn't. But the story keeps going. And here's a final thought. Maybe the reason we keep finding patterns, cycles of rise and fall, sudden dark ages, bursts of rebuilding, is because the universe itself is unpredictable. We live on a moving target. Earth spins through a shooting gallery. Sometimes we get lucky for a long time. Sometimes our luck runs out. That doesn't mean we should live in fear. It just means we should notice the signs. Listen to the old stories. Pay attention to what the rocks and layers are telling us. And remember, cosmic impacts are only one part of the story. There are other forces, closer to home, that shape the fate of civilizations. The sun, for example, has its own cycles, its own surprises, and sometimes those can be just as powerful as anything from space. But that's another theory, another piece of the puzzle. For now, the cosmic impact idea helps remind us that history isn't just about people. It's about the whole universe and how we're all connected to it, whether we realize it or not. If cosmic impacts are one giant piece of the puzzle, the sun is another. And this one is even stranger, because unlike asteroids or comets, the sun is always there. It's the reason anything lives or grows. Most of the time it's just a steady light and warmth. But sometimes the sun changes, and when it does, everything on Earth feels it. Let's start with the basics. The sun isn't perfectly steady. It has cycles. Some are short, about 11 years. Every 11 years the sun's surface gets more active. There are more sunspots, more solar flares. Sometimes it spits out huge clouds of charged particles, what scientists call coronal mass ejections. These are giant bursts of energy that race through space at millions of miles per hour. Most of the time, these solar storms just make pretty lights near the poles, the auroras. But every once in a while the sun goes wild. The storms get bigger, the blasts are stronger, and if they hit Earth, they can mess with things in a big way. Here's where it gets interesting for history. We think of solar storms as a modern problem, something that knocks out satellites or power grids. But the sun's wild moods aren't new. They've happened all through history. We just didn't have the tools to measure them until recently. So how could solar storms cause civilizations to fall? It's not obvious at first. The sun doesn't throw rocks. It doesn't smash cities. But it does have a few tricks. One of the biggest is changing our climate. Sometimes the sun gets quieter. There are fewer sunspots. Less energy reaches Earth. When that happens, the planet cools, crops fail, famine and unrest follow. Other times the sun gets more active. That can change weather patterns too, floods, droughts, or just years when nothing goes right. Scientists can track these changes by looking at tree rings and ice cores. Trees grow faster in warm, sunny years, slower when it's cold or dark. In the ice, you can see layers that match up with big solar swings. There are even radioactive particles, like carbon-14, that show when the sun was acting strange. Let's look at some historical examples. One of the most famous is the Maunder Minimum. This was a time from about 1645 to 1715 when the sun had almost no sunspots. For 70 years the sun went quiet. Europe and parts of Asia went through what's called the Little Ice Age. Rivers froze. Winters were longer and colder. Crops failed again and again. This wasn't just a cold snap. It changed history. In France, crops failed so badly that people starved. In London, the Thames River froze so hard that people held winter fairs on the ice. In China, whole regions suffered from repeated famine. Even in North America, the cold affected settlers and native peoples alike. It's tempting to think of these as just bad winters, but the timing lines up with the sun's quiet period. Scientists can see it in the tree rings and the ice. Less solar energy reached Earth. And that was enough to make a difference. It's not only the Maunder Minimum. There are signs that earlier cool periods, like the one that hit Europe around 536 CE, might also be linked to changes in the sun. In that year, people around the world noticed something was wrong. The sky went dark for months. The sun shone weakly, like the moon. Crops failed from China to Ireland. The Byzantine historian Procopius wrote that the sun gave off as much light as during an eclipse. People starved. Plagues followed. Empires weakened. For a long time, people thought only volcanoes could cause this. And yes, big eruptions can darken the sky. But some scientists now think the sun might have played a role too. A sudden drop in solar energy, combined with ash from a volcano, could make things much worse. Now let's get back to the Bronze Age. Are there signs that the sun messed with things back then? This is where the theory gets tricky. We don't have as many clear records from that far back. No one was writing about sunspots in Egypt or Mesopotamia. But the evidence is there, hidden in the earth. Scientists have looked at tree rings from ancient oaks and pines that grew during the Bronze Age. They found years when the trees barely grew at all. These frost rings show sudden cold snaps. Sometimes the cold lasted for several years. In other places, sediments and pollen show sudden shifts in what plants were growing, signs of failed crops and abandoned fields. What could cause this? One idea is that the sun went quiet for a while. A long solar minimum, like the Maunder Minimum but thousands of years earlier. If that happened, it would mean less heat, shorter growing seasons and more failed harvests. There's another clue in the form of radioactive isotopes, like carbon-14 and beryllium-10. Scientists can measure these in old trees and ice sheets. When the sun is quiet, more cosmic rays from space hit the Earth, and you get more of these particles. When the sun is active, it shields the Earth better and there are fewer. The records show big swings in these isotopes around the time of some ancient collapses. So, imagine a civilization already on the edge. They're farming as much as they can. Populations are high. Cities are full. Then the sun changes. Suddenly the weather is colder or rain patterns shift. Crops don't ripen. Food runs short. People panic. Maybe they blame their leaders. Maybe they start to fight over what little food is left. The cities can't last. It's not just cold that causes problems. Sometimes the sun gets extra active. Giant solar storms can hit Earth and cause what's called geomagnetic storms. Today, these knock out power lines and GPS. But in the past, they could have disrupted navigation, animal migrations, or even weather patterns. Some scientists think giant solar storms could have caused electrical disturbances in the atmosphere, changing rainfall and even causing lightning storms or wildfires. There's a famous event from 1859 called the Carrington Event. The sun sent out a massive burst of energy. Telegraph lines sparked and caught fire. Auroras were seen as far south as the Caribbean. If that happened today, it would probably destroy satellites and much of the world's electricity for months. Back then, it was just a strange event. But imagine something like that in ancient times. No electronics, but maybe fires, strange weather, or even changes in animal behaviour. Now, could these solar changes really explain why advanced societies vanished? Maybe not by themselves, but add them to other problems like drought, war, or disease, and things can spiral fast. It's like a domino effect. The sun tips the first domino, and the rest fall in quick succession. There are old stories that might hint at this. Myths from many cultures talk about days when the sun didn't shine, or when it burned too hot. Some talk about years without summer, or winters that never ended. Others tell of great fires in the sky, or thunderbolts from the sun god. Maybe these are just stories, or maybe they're memories of real solar events, passed down for generations. What's really interesting is how often these stories line up with the science. In Scandinavia, there are tales of the Fimbul winter, a long, deadly winter before the end of the world. In China, old records tell of red skies and strange lights that lasted for days. Even the Bible mentions days of darkness and plagues that followed. It's hard to prove exactly what happened. The records are patchy, but when you line up the clues, tree rings, ice cores, old stories, they start to fit together. Not perfectly, but enough to make you look twice. Let's step back for a second and think about what this means. Civilizations look strong from the outside, big walls, huge monuments, armies, but deep down, they're vulnerable to things they can't control. The sun is the ultimate example. It's so far away, but its moods can change everything on Earth. Sometimes the smallest change, a little less warmth, a little more activity, can push a whole society over the edge. And it raises a strange thought. If the sun has these cycles, and if even small changes can wreck a civilization, how many times has this happened? How many lost cultures disappeared, not because of war or invasion, but because the sun quietly shifted and the world changed with it? There's another twist. The sun's cycles seem random on small timescales, but over thousands of years some patterns show up. There are hints of longer cycles, ones that last 200, 400, even 2,000 years. These grand solar minima and maxima show up in tree rings and ice records all over the world. Some historians have noticed that big periods of change, like the fall of Rome, the collapse of the Maya, or the end of the Bronze Age, sometimes line up with these long solar swings. It's not a perfect match every time, but it happens enough to make people wonder if the sun has a secret schedule, quietly shaping the story of life on Earth. Plus, there's the question of magnetic fields. When the sun is active, Earth's magnetic field gets pushed and pulled. This can cause strange things to happen. Animal migrations go off course. Weather gets weird. Some people even think it affects human mood and health, though that's harder to prove. Here's something that's easy to forget. For most of history, people watch the skies all the time, They noticed when something was off: a red sun, strange halos, nights that never got truly dark. People didn't know about solar cycles or magnetic storms, but they felt the effects. Sometimes they wrote them down. Sometimes they turned them into legends. The big idea here isn't that the sun alone brings down civilizations. It's that the sun can set the stage. It can make a bad situation worse. If you're already facing drought, a few cold years or weird storms can tip everything into chaos. If you're at peace, you might survive. But if your society is stretched thin, the sun's changes can be the last straw. And the sun isn't done yet. Its cycles keep going. Even now, scientists watch for the next big solar storm. They check tree rings and ice cores for clues about the past and the future. We're better prepared in some ways, but still vulnerable in others. It's humbling to realize how much we depend on this one star. How a small shift in its mood can rewrite history. Maybe that's why so many ancient cultures worshipped the sun. They knew, deep down, that everything started and ended with its light. So when you hear about lost civilizations, great cities that vanished, empires that fell, remember that some of the answers might be hidden in the sky, not just in rocks from space, but in the daily rise and fall of the sun itself. And here's one last thing to think about. The sun and cosmic impacts aren't enemies. Sometimes they work together. A solar minimum makes the Earth more vulnerable to impacts from space. Or a big solar storm could hit just as a comet passes close by. The universe isn't neat or simple. Sometimes disasters line up. But even when things get bad, something always survives. Life keeps going. People adapt. They find new ways to live, new stories to tell. That's the real pattern. Change, collapse, and then, somehow, a new beginning. So, after everything we've talked about, disasters, collapses, ice ages, and ancient cities wiped out, you might wonder, what actually makes it through all this? When the dust settles, when the ash clears, when the sun shines again, what's left behind? It turns out even when almost everything falls apart, something always survives, and that something isn't always what you'd expect. Let's start with the most obvious survivors. People. Not everyone, of course. Sometimes only a tiny fraction. But the human story is one of survival, even in the worst conditions. When cities crumble, some people always manage to hang on. Maybe they leave their homes and wander. Maybe they go back to simpler ways of living, farming, hunting, whatever works. Sometimes they hide out in mountains, valleys, or forests. Sometimes their only advantage is being in the right place at the right time. But it's not just the people who make it through. It's also what they remember, the stories they tell, the things they carry in their heads and hearts, not just in their hands. When you look at the end of a civilization, the picture isn't just ruins and empty streets. It's also the people who walk away from those ruins, carrying pieces of the old world with them. Here's an example. After the Bronze Age collapse, when the big cities around the Mediterranean fell, people didn't just disappear. Many became refugees. Some moved into the hills or onto islands. They took with them what they could. Maybe a few tools, maybe some precious objects, but mostly they took their stories, myths, songs, family tales. These things could be carried without weight. They didn't need to survive a fire or a flood. They just needed someone to remember. And over time, these memories changed. They blended with new experiences. Some details faded. Others grew larger. Heroes became giants. Disasters became battles between gods. What started as a memory of a real event, like a volcanic eruption or a great flood, could become a legend passed down for generations. But let's get concrete. What else survives a collapse besides people and stories? Sometimes it's technology. Not the kind that needs big factories or a power grid, but simple, strong ideas. Things like farming methods, ways to make pottery, how to build a shelter, or how to find fresh water. These are the things that people teach their kids, even if they lose everything else. Think about how many times farming was lost and then found again. After the fall of the Indus Valley civilization, for example, big cities vanished, writing disappeared, but farming kept going. People still knew how to grow wheat and barley. They still kept cattle and goats. They passed down these skills, even when the bigger culture around them was gone. Or look at ancient Egypt. After the old kingdom collapsed, the government broke down. Monument building stopped. Writing became rare. But people still farmed along the Nile. They still used irrigation canals. They still baked bread and brewed beer the same way their grandparents did. Sometimes, even small details survive for thousands of years. For example, the way people weave baskets or paint pottery. The designs might change a little, but the basic methods stick around. Archaeologists can sometimes trace a single style of basket weaving across centuries, even as languages, religions, and governments come and go. Then there are the things that survive by accident. Think about objects buried in mud, ice, or ash. These things are saved from decay just because they were in the right place at the right time. A clay tablet falls into a well and is forgotten for 2,000 years. A wooden boat sinks in a peat bog and never rots. Sometimes whole towns are buried by a volcano, like Pompeii, and then rediscovered much later, almost perfectly preserved. But even when objects survive, it's rare for everything to make it through. Most things vanish. Wood rots, cloth unravels, metal rusts. What's left is mostly stone, pottery, or something saved by pure luck. That's why so much of ancient history is built on tiny scraps and broken pieces. A single bead, the tip of a bone needle, a cracked piece of pottery with a mark scratched into it. And here's something strange. Sometimes it's the simplest things that last the longest. Stone tools from 1,000,000 years ago still look almost new, but a wooden statue from 200 years ago can turn to dust in a day if it isn't cared for. So when we look at the deep past, we see more of what's made of stone, bone, or clay, not because they were the most important, but because they're the hardest to destroy. But let's go back to stories for a minute, because this is where things get interesting. Over and over, when a culture falls, its stories shift and travel. Take the flood myths, for example. Nearly every culture has a story about a great flood that wiped out the world. In Mesopotamia, there's the story of Utnapishtim, who survives a huge flood by building a boat. In the Bible, it's Noah. In India, it's Manu. In China, it's You the Great, who tames the waters. Are these stories memories of real floods? Maybe. Sometimes they match up with what we know about climate events or sea level rises. Other times they seem more symbolic, a way to explain why the world is the way it is, or to warn about what happens if people forget the old ways. But even if the details are fuzzy, the fact that these stories survive is important. They carry a message across thousands of years. Things can fall apart, but life goes on. People remember, even if the facts get jumbled. Here's another angle. Sometimes, after a collapse, the survivors start something totally new. They mix old ideas with new ones. They build new cultures from the pieces of the old. That's how you get the rise of new civilizations out of the ashes of the old ones. After the Bronze Age collapse, the Greeks rebuilt. They didn't copy the Mycenaeans exactly. They invented new ways of life, new kinds of government, new styles of art, new stories. Sometimes you can see the fingerprints of the old world in the new one. Words, symbols, or even building methods get reused. In Turkey, for example, stones from ruined Hittite cities ended up in new walls built by later people. In Egypt, Old statues got new faces carved on them by new kings. Even when people wanted to start over, they couldn't help reusing what was left. It's the same with languages. When a big culture falls, the language might change. But some words stick around, especially for things like water, bread, or the sun. Linguists, people who study languages, can sometimes trace these old words back through time, like following a trail of breadcrumbs. And here's something to think about. Not everything that survives is physical. Some of the most important things are ideas, beliefs about the world, right and wrong, the meaning of life. These are harder to see in the archaeological record, but they matter just as much. Sometimes, a new culture is shaped by the old stories and beliefs, even if they don't remember where they came from. Let's look at another example. The Maya in Central America. Their classic cities collapsed around 900 CE. The great stone temples were abandoned. Writing stopped. For a long time, outsiders thought the Maya had disappeared, but they hadn't. Their descendants still lived in the forests. They still spoke Maya languages. They still kept some of the old traditions, planting corn, honouring ancestors, telling old stories. Even today, you can find echoes of the ancient Maya in the lives of people across Mexico, Guatemala, and Belize. Now think about the Roman Empire. Rome itself fell in 476 CE. The Western Empire broke apart. But Roman ideas didn't just vanish. The Eastern Roman Empire, or Byzantium, carried on for another 1,000 years. Even after that ended, Roman law, roads, and building styles shaped Europe for centuries. The idea of Rome survived long after the city's power was gone. Sometimes, survival is about adaptation. People change their ways to fit the new world. After the last ice age, for example, the big animals died out. People couldn't hunt mammoths anymore, so they learned to fish or gather shellfish instead. When farming spread, old hunting groups became settled villages. The skills changed, but the will to survive stayed the same. And then there's the question of memory. What do we actually remember about these lost worlds? Sometimes the answer is almost nothing. Sometimes it's just a name or a rumour or a strange object with no clear purpose. Other times, small clues can help us piece together a much bigger story. Think about Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. It's over 11,000 years old, older than any known city. For thousands of years it was completely buried. No one alive remembered who built it or why. But when it was dug up in the 1990s, it changed what we thought we knew about the past. Suddenly we saw proof that people could build huge, complex things long before anyone thought they could. So, even when memory fades, the land can still hold secrets. Sometimes those secrets are found by accident. A farmer digging a well, a hiker stumbling over a stone, a scientist reading strange marks on a bone. But all these survivors, people, skills, stories, objects, have one thing in common. They're not always the same as what came before. They change, they adapt. The story shifts with each new teller. Now, let's talk about what doesn't survive. This is just as important. Most of what a civilization creates is lost. Not just the buildings and the art, but also the small details. Recipes, jokes, the exact sound of someone's voice. Languages vanish. Names fade. Entire peoples leave only a trace. But sometimes, the loss itself becomes part of the story. Later cultures look at the ruins and wonder, who built this? What happened to them? The mystery becomes a kind of inheritance. It shapes how people see themselves, even if they don't know the real answers. There's a kind of resilience in this. Even when things fall apart, the urge to remember, to rebuild, to make meaning, always comes back. It's almost like a law of nature. Collapse is never the final chapter. there's always someone left to ask questions, to pick up the pieces, to start over. And if you look at the big picture, you see a pattern. Over and over, civilizations rise, fall, and leave behind something new. Sometimes it's a technology, like bronze or writing or the wheel. Sometimes it's a piece of art, a song, or a way of telling time. Sometimes it's just a story about a hero who once saved the world. Even when the evidence is thin, you can feel the thread connecting us to those distant people. Every time you use a tool, plant a seed, or tell a story, you're part of something old. You're carrying a piece of what survived. And here's one last thought. Survival isn't always about strength. Sometimes it's about being flexible. The people who made it through the worst times weren't always the biggest or the richest. Sometimes they were the ones who could change when everything else changed. The ones who could let go of old ways and try something new. That's what really survives collapse. Not just objects or skills, but the ability to adapt. The ability to start again with whatever's left. So, when you think about lost civilizations, don't just picture empty ruins or forgotten names. Picture the survivors, the storytellers, the inventors, the ones who carried a spark of the old world into the new. Because in the end, that's what keeps going. That's what makes us human. And those survivors left us something. The stories they told became the oldest memories of our species. They became mythology. Let's take a step back. Imagine standing at the edge of a ruined city. The stones are cold. Grass grows where people once walked. You hear the wind, maybe a bird in the distance. There's nobody left to explain what happened here. No signs, no voices, just empty space and broken walls. But if you listen, there's something else. Not a sound, but a feeling. A whisper from the past travelling across generations. That's what mythology is. The memory of a world that's gone, carried not by stone or bone, but by words and imagination. So, why do so many old stories sound like memories of real disasters? Why do myths from different cultures, places that never met, tell such similar tales? Floods that cover the land, fires from the sky, ages of darkness, golden ages lost forever. These stories aren't just made up for fun. They're the echoes of things people actually lived through. Sometimes they're the only record we have. Here's how it works. After a collapse, most details get lost. People forget dates, names, even places. But the feeling of what happened, the fear, the wonder, the confusion, sticks around. Over time, those feelings get turned into stories. The details shift. Real events might become legends about angry gods or magical creatures. Names change, but the core of the story survives. Think about it like this. Imagine your grandparents telling you about something that happened long before you were born. Maybe a war, a famine, a huge storm. They don't remember every fact. They mix up what they saw with what they heard. Maybe they add a little drama. Then you tell your kids, and they tell theirs. After a few generations, what started as a real event becomes a family legend. But at its heart, it's still a memory. Now, let's look at some real examples. The story of a great flood shows up all over the world. We talked about it before, but let's dig deeper. In the Middle East, the Epic of Gilgamesh tells of a hero who survives a flood that destroys everything. In the Bible, it's Noah. In India, Manu is saved by a giant fish. In Greece, Deucalion and his wife build a chest to ride out the flood. In China, there's a story about floods that cover the land, tamed only by a wise ruler. Even in the Americas, there are stories of the world being washed clean by water. Why are these stories so common? Some people say they're just natural. Floods happen everywhere, so of course people write about them. But sometimes the details are strange. In Mesopotamia, the story talks about a boat full of animals. In India, Manu is warned by a talking fish. In Greece, Deucalion survives by building a chest, not a boat. The details change, but the pattern is the same. Something terrible happens, almost everyone is lost, and a small group survives to start over. Here's where it gets even more interesting. Sometimes science backs up the old stories. Around 7,600 years ago, the Black Sea was a freshwater lake. Then, sea levels rose. Salt water from the Mediterranean poured in through the Bosporus. It flooded the land, maybe as much as 60,000 square miles. Imagine living there when the water started to rise. You'd run. You'd panic. Maybe you'd build a boat. Maybe you'd tell your children about a flood that never stopped. Archaeologists have found villages on the old shores of the Black Sea, buried under layers of mud. There's no written record from that time, but the memory could have survived as a story. Passed down, changed, but still linked to something real. But floods aren't the only myth memories. Let's talk about fire from the sky. In many cultures, there are legends about a time when fire rained down or when the sun went dark. In Australia, some Aboriginal stories remember a fiery star that crashed into the land, burning everything. In North America, some Native American stories tell of a time when the sky fell, bringing fire and chaos. Could these be memories of real impacts? Maybe. Around 12,800 years ago, something big changed. The Younger Dryas, a sudden cold snap, started. Some scientists believe it was caused by a comet or asteroid impact. There are strange layers in the soil, tiny bits of melted rock and rare metals. No writing, of course, but the people who lived through it may have remembered the sky turning dark or fire burning the earth. That story could become a legend about angry gods or a world-ending war. Even volcanoes leave their mark in myth. In Indonesia, there's the story of Mount Tambora, which erupted in 1815. The explosion was so loud, people heard it 1,200 miles away. The sky went dark for months. Crops failed. People starved as far away as Europe and China. Locally, stories grew up about gods in anger or spirits lost in the mountain. Some of those stories are still told today. Go back even further, and you find legends about mountains exploding or islands sinking. In the Mediterranean, there are tales of Atlantis, the lost island swallowed by the sea. Plato wrote about it, but even he admitted he was drawing from older stories. Could Atlantis be a memory of Thera, the volcano that exploded and wiped out a great island culture? Some people think so. Even the Maya in Central America have stories about ages of the world destroyed by fire, flood, or monsters. Each age ends in disaster, but life always returns. In their stories, the world is built and rebuilt many times. It's a cycle, not a straight line. Let's not forget the Norse. In their myths, the world ends in Ragnarok, a great winter, battles, and fire that destroys everything. But after the chaos, a few survivors come out of hiding. They find a new world, fresh and green. The pattern is always the same: disaster, survival, and a new beginning. So, why do these myths matter? Some people say they're just fairy tales, stories to scare children or explain the unknown. But that's missing the point. Myths are memory. They're the way people hold on to what matters most when everything else is gone. They warn, they teach, and sometimes they comfort. Think about the lesson in a flood story. It's not just about water, it's about change. Things can be lost in an instant. You have to be ready. Sometimes you need to start over. Sometimes you need to listen to warnings, even if they sound impossible. Here's another angle. Myths can act as maps. Not maps you can fold up and use to find your way, but maps of danger, of memory, of hope. In Australia, some Aboriginal songlines, ancient routes across the land, are passed down as stories. They tell of places you should avoid, places where water can be found, and places where something terrible once happened. Sometimes those places match up with real risks. Flood zones, fire scars, or old meteor craters. Now, let's talk about the idea of lost knowledge. Imagine a world where most people can't read or write. The only way to pass down what you know is by telling stories. If you want your children to remember something important, you make it unforgettable. You add magic, heroes, or monsters. That way, even if the details change, the core idea survives. For example, take the story of Prometheus from Greece. He steals fire from the gods and gives it to humans. The gods punish him, but humans now have the power to survive cold nights, cook food, and build cities. Is this just a story about rebellion? Or is it a memory of the moment humans learned to control fire? Maybe it's both. Or look at the story of the Tower of Babel. People try to build a tower to reach the sky. The gods get angry and scatter them, giving them different languages. Some people see it as a warning against pride. Others see it as a way of explaining why there are so many languages. But it might also be a memory of an ancient city that fell, a place where people from many lands once gathered before something happened to break them apart. Sometimes myths remember real places. The city of Troy was thought to be a legend until archaeologists found its ruins in Turkey. The city of Uruk in Sumer was once just a name in old stories. Now we know it was one of the world's first real cities. Myths can be clues, hints that something important happened in a place long ago. But here's where it gets tricky. Myths aren't perfect records. They change, twist and turn. Heroes become gods. Villains become monsters. Real events get mixed with dreams. Over time it gets harder and harder to tell what's real and what's not. But that doesn't mean there's nothing true in them. It just means you have to look deeper. Let's look at another example, the story of giants. All over the world there are legends about giant people who once lived on Earth. In North America, some native stories talk about a race of huge people who built mounds and carried giant stones. In Europe, stories about giants explain the big stone circles like Stonehenge. Are these just tall tales? Or could they be memories of a time when people found the bones of mammoths and mastodons? Maybe they dug up a huge skull and couldn't explain it, so they created a story. And sometimes myths hold warnings. In Japan, there are stories about tsunamis called tsunami stones. These are real stones carved with warnings. Some are hundreds of years old. They say, do not build your house below this point. People who listened survived the next big wave. People who forgot paid the price. So myths aren't just old stories. They're survival tools. They keep memories alive when writing is gone, when languages change, when cities fall. They help people remember where not to build, when to plant, what to fear, and what to celebrate. Here's something wild science sometimes catches up to myth. For a long time, people thought the story of a fiery star crashing into the Earth was just a legend. Then, scientists found a giant crater in Arizona. It's over 4,000 feet wide. It was made by a meteor about 50,000 years ago. No written records from that time, but maybe, just maybe, the memory lasted in story form. Or take the story of the long winter in Norse myth. In the last few years, scientists have found evidence of a real volcanic winter around 536 CE. The sky went dark. Crops failed. People starved across Europe and Asia. Some say the legend of Ragnarok was shaped by memories of that time, a world ending cold, followed by survival and rebuilding. Let's talk for a minute about why humans do this, why we turn events into stories, and stories into myth. The truth is, our brains are wired for stories. We remember stories better than lists of facts. We share stories around fires, at dinner, or before bed. Stories help us make sense of things that are too big, too scary, or too strange to understand. When something terrible happens, a flood, a fire, a war, turning it into a story helps us heal. It gives us hope. And stories move. They travel with people when they leave home. Refugees carry stories, not just things. When a city falls, the objects stay, but the stories go on. Over time, stories change to fit new places, new languages, new fears. But the core memory stays, hidden inside each new version. Sometimes, myths even predict real dangers. In the Pacific, some islands have stories about the wave that eats the land. When scientists studied old tsunamis, they found that these stories matched up with real, ancient waves. People who listened to the stories knew to run when the sea pulled back. Here's what strikes me most. The oldest stories are often the ones about loss, survival, and starting again. Maybe that's because those are the moments that matter most. When everything else is gone, memory is all you have. And if you can turn memory into a story, a myth, it can outlast stone, metal, or even language. But there's another side. Sometimes myths are all we have left of a lost world. When the last written word is gone, when the old language is forgotten, when buildings have turned to dust, the only thing that survives is memory, wrapped up in a tale. It's not perfect, it's not always clear, but it's a thread connecting us to people who lived and died long before us. So next time you hear an old myth about a flood, a fire, a lost city, or a hero, remember, you might be hearing the memory of someone who lived through disaster and survived. You might be holding a piece of the world that came before. Myths aren't just stories, they're survival, they're warning signs, maps, and sometimes the only way we know what really happened. And that's why mythology matters, even now. It's the oldest form of memory. It's how people kept the thread of the past alive, even when everything else was lost. In a way, every myth is a message in a bottle, sent across time to whoever finds it next. We've looked at the pattern of rise and fall. We've seen the survivors and the stories they carried. We've seen how myth can be a memory of real events, sometimes distorted, but never empty. Myths are the memory of lost worlds, kept alive by people who refuse to let go. And that brings us to an important question. If myths are memories, and if the cycle of rise and fall keeps repeating, where are we right now? Are we at the beginning, the middle, or somewhere near the end of our own story? That's what we'll look at next. So, here we are, the big question. If lost civilizations keep disappearing, and their stories barely survive as myths or ruins, what about us? Are we next? Where do we fit in this cycle? It's not a cheerful thought, but it's one worth exploring. Not to scare ourselves, but to understand the bigger picture. After all, if this keeps happening, maybe there's something we can learn before it's our turn. Let's start with the basics. Every time a civilization collapsed in the past, people living through it thought their world was permanent. They built big cities, invented new things, made art and wrote laws. They traded across mountains and oceans. They believed their way of life would last forever. But it didn't. Something always came along. A drought, a war, a disease, an eruption, or sometimes something from space. And when those things hit, the world changed so fast that most people couldn't keep up. Now look around at our world today. We have technology those old empires couldn't even dream about. We fly across the planet in hours. We talk to each other instantly, no matter where we are. We build towers so tall, they'd look like magic to someone from the past. We've mapped our genes, walked on the moon, and sent probes out past the edge of our solar system. But here's the thing. Every civilization thought they were special. The Sumerians invented writing and the wheel. The Egyptians built pyramids that still stand after thousands of years. The Romans built roads, aqueducts and cities all across Europe, North Africa and the Middle East. The Maya tracked the stars with stunning accuracy. People in China invented paper and gunpowder. None of them believed they would vanish, and yet most of what they built is gone. So could we be next? It sounds dramatic, but let's break it down. What actually causes civilizations to collapse? Is it bad luck or is there a pattern? And if there's a pattern, are we following it right now? A lot of researchers have tried to answer this. Some point to resources. When a society uses up what's around them, they run into trouble. If you cut down all the trees, the soil washes away. If you over-farm, the ground gets tired. If you hunt too many animals, they disappear. Easter Island is a famous example. The people there cut down almost every tree. They needed wood for canoes and moving statues. But without trees, the soil blew away, birds left, and their society shrank. Could something like that happen on a bigger scale today? Maybe not with trees, but with other resources, like clean water, good soil, or even rare minerals for our electronics. Then there's climate. History shows that even small shifts can cause big problems. A few years of bad weather and crops can fail. People get hungry, angry, they move or fight. When the climate changed in the past, like during the Little Ice Age in the 1600s, people in Europe faced cold summers, short harvests, and famines. In the Middle East, a long drought ended the Akkadian Empire. Some scientists think a dry spell helped bring down the Maya. Today, we know climate can change, and it's changing now, just faster and in stranger ways than we've seen before. Are we ready? That's an open question. Let's talk about disease. When the Black Death hit Europe in the 1300s, it wiped out as much as half the population in some places. Whole towns vanished. The survivors rebuilt, but the world they made was different. Today we have medicine that past people couldn't imagine. We have vaccines, antibiotics and hospitals. But we also have huge cities, fast travel, and more people packed close together. When a new disease appears, it can spread faster than ever. We saw it with COVID-19. It's not the first, and it probably won't be the last. And then there's war. History is full of conflicts that toppled empires. Sometimes it was outside invaders. Sometimes it was fights between groups inside. The Roman Empire broke apart slowly, but invasions by barbarians sped up the end. The Mongols swept across Asia and Europe, leaving cities empty. Today we have weapons that could destroy whole cities, or even the whole planet. It's a scary thought, but it's real. The risk is always there, even if we don't like to think about it. But here's something new. Our world is more connected than any in history. Trade, money, ideas, even viruses. Everything moves faster and farther. That's good in some ways. It means we can help each other, share knowledge, and solve problems together. But it also means trouble can spread quickly. When something breaks in one part of the world, it can cause problems everywhere. Think of the 2008 financial crisis. A few bad loans in the US triggered a global meltdown. Or the pandemic. What started as a few cases in one city became a worldwide crisis in months. So, if we're so advanced, why do experts still worry about collapse? It's because the bigger and more complex a system gets, the more fragile it can become. Think of it like a huge fancy machine. If one small part breaks, the whole thing can stop working. In the past, a city could fall, and the next one over might not even notice. Now, if something goes wrong in a major city, it can ripple across the globe in days. Let's look at a few examples of how things can unravel fast. In 2003, a blackout hit the northeastern US and parts of Canada. 50 million people lost power. It started with a single software bug and a series of small mistakes. Suddenly, whole cities went dark. Trains stopped. Water pumps failed. Hospitals switched to backup power. People were stuck in elevators. The lights came back in a day or two, but it showed how quickly things could fall apart. Or take the global supply chain. During the pandemic, ships got stuck, factories closed, and suddenly there were shortages of everything from computer chips to toilet paper. Supermarkets that always seemed full had empty shelves. It wasn't the end of the world, but it showed how tightly everything is connected. Now, some people say, but we're smarter now. We have technology. We can solve problems faster. And that's true up to a point. But sometimes technology creates new risks. We depend on the internet for almost everything. If it goes down, so does banking, travel, even food delivery. Cyber attacks have already shut down pipelines and hospitals. What if something bigger hit? And then there's artificial intelligence. It's moving fast, faster than most people realize. AI can help us solve problems, but it can also make mistakes or be used in dangerous ways. What happens if we lose control over something so powerful? That's not science fiction anymore. It's a real question scientists and leaders are asking right now. Let's step back for a second. If you look at the big picture, civilization is like a chain. Each link depends on the one before and after. If one snaps, the rest can follow. In the past, the chain was short, just a few links. Now it stretches around the world. Stronger, yes, but also more complicated. Some historians use the word resilience to describe how well a society can bounce back from trouble. In older times, people grew their own food, fixed their own tools, and relied on neighbours. If something failed, they could adapt. Now, most of us don't know how to farm, hunt, or build from scratch. We rely on specialists, machines, and networks. That's efficient, but it also means most people don't know how to survive if those systems break. Here's an example. Imagine a city loses power for a week. No light, no heat, no running water. How many people know how to find clean water, make a fire, or keep food from spoiling? Not many. We're used to comfort, not hardship. That doesn't make us weak, but it does make us different from our ancestors. But it's not all bad news. People are adaptable. When disaster hits, some panic, but others step up. After hurricanes, earthquakes, or fires, you see neighbours helping neighbours. Strangers become friends. People find ways to survive, even when things seem hopeless. It's happened before, and it would happen again. Now, let's talk about what would really survive if our world faced a major collapse. Imagine our cities empty, our technology gone. What would be left for the future to find? Some buildings might last, a few stone or concrete structures, maybe parts of bridges or tunnels. Most of what we've made would decay or rust away in a few hundred years. Plastic would stick around the longest, but even that breaks down over time. Satellites and radio signals would fade. Digital records could be lost if there's no power to read them. So, what about our stories, our myths? If the internet vanished, if books crumbled, what would people remember? Probably not much. Maybe a few tales passed down by word of mouth. Maybe legends about the old world with its flying machines and screens everywhere. Maybe stories about a time when people could talk across oceans or explore the stars. But the details would fade just like they did for the Greeks, the Sumerians, or the Maya. Think about this. What would someone in the far future think if they dug up a city like New York or Tokyo after 1,000 years? They might find strange shapes of metal, plastic, and glass, maybe carvings or statues. They'd find clues, but most of the meaning would be lost. Without our language, our stories, and our context, it would be like us finding a piece of a Roman aqueduct or an Egyptian amulet. Impressive, but mysterious. Now let's look at the question of warning. If we know collapse is possible, maybe even likely, does that mean we can stop it? Or are we just as blind as those past empires? Some people say yes, we see the risks and can act. Others say human nature doesn't change and we're doomed to repeat the cycle. Here's what history shows. Sometimes people see the warning signs and change course. Sometimes they ignore them. The problem is, it's hard to know when you're living through the warning, or just another rough patch. In the past, some groups moved, changed how they lived, or made peace with neighbours to survive. Others kept doing the same thing until it was too late. So, are we next? In one sense, maybe. No civilization has lasted forever. The odds say ours won't either, not exactly as it is now. But that doesn't mean it's the end of everything. Each time something survives. People adapt. New cultures and ideas grow out of the old. And there's a bigger lesson here. Even if what we call our world changes, the thread of humanity keeps going. The things that matter most, kindness, courage, curiosity, those can outlast any city or empire. Our tools and gadgets might vanish, but the urge to share stories, to connect and to rebuild is much harder to erase. Some people imagine the end of civilization as a sudden dramatic event. But most collapses are slow. Things get harder, life gets smaller, people forget how things used to be. Maybe a few remember the old stories, and those stories become the new myths. Maybe one day, someone will tell a story about the time when people could talk to each other across the sky, or watch moving pictures on glowing boxes. To them, it will sound like magic. But here's what strikes me most. In every collapse, there's always a point where people look back and wonder when things changed. Sometimes they realize too late. Other times they start something new. The end of one world is the beginning of another. So, are we next? Maybe, maybe not. But we're not powerless. We can listen to the warnings, both from history and from our own time. We can learn, adapt, and make choices that help us survive. We can value the things that last, community, memory, simple skills, and we can tell our own stories so that even if the details fade, the memory stays alive. History isn't just about what's lost, it's about what gets carried forward. The survivors aren't always the strongest or the richest or the smartest. Sometimes they're just the most stubborn, the ones who refuse to give up, the ones who keep trying, even when the old ways stop working. So, as we look at our world, busy, noisy, and sometimes fragile, it's worth asking ourselves, what do we want to leave behind? What stories will future people tell about us? Will they remember us for what we built, or for how we faced hard times? For our machines, or for our spirit? We can't control everything. Disasters might come. Change is certain. But the pattern of history isn't just about endings. It's about survival, rebirth, and the stubborn hope that tomorrow can be better, even if today is hard. And that's where our story fits. We're not the first to wonder if our world will last. We won't be the last. But as long as someone remembers, rebuilds, and tells the story, something of us survives, and that's worth holding on to. But here's what the pattern also tells us. Something always survives. Someone always rebuilds. And you, listening to this tonight, you're proof of that. So what do we actually do with all of this? After hearing about old worlds wiped away, myths that might be faded memories, and how even advanced civilizations can just vanish. It's easy to get lost in big, scary questions, but it's also a chance to see things from a wider angle. let's take a breath and look at what this whole pattern really means for us, for history, and for the future. First, there's something kind of humbling about it all. It's easy to think we're at the very top of the mountain, smarter and safer than anyone before us. But history keeps showing us that nothing is set in stone. There could have been people long ago who built, invented, or dreamed in ways we can barely imagine. Maybe their stories are gone, erased by disaster or time. Maybe we're just another stop on the road, not the final destination. That's not a bad thing to remember. It keeps us honest. It pushes us to ask better questions. We don't have to know every answer, but we can at least admit there's a lot we don't understand. There's always more out there, under the ground, in old stories, even in the skies above us. Think about the way we learn about the past. Most of what we know comes from lucky finds. A clay tablet that survived a fire, a stone carving that didn't get smashed, bones in the right kind of soil. Now and then someone stumbles on a buried city, or a frozen body, or a message written in code. Suddenly the whole story shifts. What we thought we knew gets turned upside down. That's true for our own time too. We trust our records, digital, printed, passed around the world in seconds. But those are just as fragile as anything made of clay or paper. If the power goes out, or the internet disappears, how much would be lost? Would someone in the far future know what mattered to us? Or would they just find scraps and guess? It's a strange thought, but also kind of freeing. Maybe it's not about what survives in stone or silicon. Maybe it's about what survives in people, in the ways we treat each other, and in the stories we pass down. Here's something else to keep in mind. Civilizations don't just end because of big single disasters. More often, it's a slow slide. People stop fixing things. They lose trust. Traditions start to fade. The old ways don't work anymore, but nobody knows what to do next. That slow drift is hard to notice when you're living through it. It's only obvious when you look back, years or centuries later. So, what keeps a culture strong? Not armies, not walls, not even technology. It's the ability to change without falling apart, to learn from mistakes, to remember what's important, even if the world outside is shifting fast. Sometimes the most valuable thing isn't how high you build, but how well you can bend without snapping. Let's not forget how creative people can be when times are tough. Some of the brightest ideas have come out of hardship. When things break, people find new ways to fix them. When old stories aren't enough, someone tells a new one. When the world feels lost, there's always someone willing to try again. There's a quiet sort of power in that. Even when whole eras vanish, the spark that drives humans forward doesn't go out. It hides, waits, then returns in a new form. The details change, the spirit stays. And here's a twist that might surprise you. Sometimes what looks like the end is really a beginning. When Rome fell, it looked like darkness. But in the ruins, new cultures grew up. New languages, new art, new ways of living. The same things keep happening over and over in different places with different faces. It's not always pretty or peaceful, but it's real. And it means that loss doesn't always win. Another thing to think about is how much we depend on each other now. In the past, a single village or town could survive on its own for a while. These days, we're all tied together by trade, by ideas, by problems. That makes us stronger in some ways, but it also means trouble can spread farther, faster. It's a balance. If we want to avoid the mistakes of the past, maybe the answer is to look out for each other, not just ourselves. So what do we do, knowing all this? Maybe it's about being awake to the risks, but not frozen by fear. It's about making choices that don't just make life easier now, but help future people too. Planting trees we might never sit under. fixing problems before they get too big, keeping old skills and stories alive just in case. It also means being honest about what we don't know. There could be more lost civilizations, more mysteries, more stories waiting to be found. That's not a reason to give up. It's a reason to stay curious, to keep digging, keep learning, keep sharing what we find. You might be lying there right now wondering if any of this really matters. But it does, because it reminds us we're part of something bigger. We're not the first to wonder what comes next, and we won't be the last. Every generation faces its own challenges. Every group has to decide what's worth saving and what's just noise. Maybe the real lesson is this: nothing lasts forever. But that's not a reason to despair. It's a reason to cherish what we have while we have it, to pass on what's good, to learn from what went wrong, and to remember that even when the world changes, the heart of being human, hope, kindness, the drive to connect, can still shine through. So as you drift off tonight, think of yourself as a link in a long, unbroken chain. People before you faced things they couldn't control. They survived. They rebuilt. They dreamed, even in the dark. Now it's our turn to carry that light in whatever way we can. We may never know all the answers. We may never solve every mystery. But we can keep asking questions. We can keep telling stories. We can hold on to the things that matter: love, courage, the simple joy of being here at all. And if someday someone far in the future finds a piece of our world, a song, a tool, a story, they'll know we were here. They'll know we wondered, we hoped, we tried. That's enough. That's the real legacy. Not buildings, not machines, but the stubborn will to keep going. So wherever you are tonight, remember, you're part of a much bigger story. You carry the strength of all those who came before, and whatever tomorrow brings, that's something no disaster can ever erase. May your dreams be gentle. May your worries fade. May you wake tomorrow with hope, ready to build whatever comes next.